One of the things I want to ask you both about is vaccine passports. We're seeing some provinces end them. For example, Saskatchewan and Alberta have announced they want to end them, but BC has extended their vaccine passport. What do you think is going to take to end that policy? And is it going to be incremental? For example, could it remain required for some places, but not others, like in areas like long-term care facilities where the risk is higher, but not required in perhaps lower risk settings like restaurants? Oh, sorry, Professor Alford, you can start.
Your last question, I think they're going to try to manage the perception that things are being phased out in a very prudent way. So I can see LTCs and other facilities being the last to go. The question that we have to ask is, if people are willing to have rapid antigen tests, what purpose does it serve to have a vaccine passport? And the real problem that we have constitutionally, particularly with respect to BC, is that there are people who very much want to visit elderly relatives in long-term care facilities. They're allergic to polyethylene glycol. They can't get a COVID vaccine.
Sorry, Professor Alford, what would the allergy, what's that in?
Well, there are certain rare medical conditions that prevent vaccination.
Okay.
And in the event of BC, there's no provision for people who have established that they meet these stringent conditions for demonstrating the rare medical exemption, can have an exemption to the vaccine passport. So with respect to long-term care facilities, if that's the last place to require them, you're putting the residents of those long-term care facilities in a terrible situation where they can't be visited by a caregiver. And not only is that unconstitutional, it's terribly cruel.
And it also would have an impact on the rights of those individuals in the care homes, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's quite right. We shouldn't abstract away from the fact that vaccine passports harm far more than the people who have medical exemptions or have human rights exemptions that are not being honored.
Professor Serafin, what about masking requirements? Do you think that's maybe going to be the last thing to go? Are we going to be wearing masks for a long time? And what might it take for mask requirements to be removed? And like vaccine passports, might it happen incrementally?
I think it'll have to happen incrementally because people are at this point used to wearing them. Even I put them on, just by force of habit now. And there's this sort of like, it's like a safety blanket for people almost when they go out, they wear masks. So if you don't do this incrementally, then I think that they're going to get some backlash from certain people who don't feel safe going outside. And so, masking in schools even though it looks like there's no actual benefit to masking small children in schools, I suspect we're going to have this policy around for at least a little while yet.
And what might it take to finally end that? What are the criteria that the government might be using to continue to have a policy like this?
Truthfully, I'm not sure what the criteria in support of masking are at this point, especially in the school setting. So that is a very good question, and I wish I had an answer.
Professor Alford, I want to ask about another restriction, which are the restrictions on our borders. These have changed significantly throughout the pandemic, from having a period where we had these quarantine hotels to now having to show proof of vaccination to travel. What do you think, how long do you think these border restrictions might remain in place, and what might it take for us to say, finally, this is done, we're a free and open country again?
This is really going to be the longest lasting, because once these get in place, they get put into protocols and systems that are really transnational. So you have a system whereby, for instance, in Europe, everything's being coordinated through the European Union. It's so difficult to dismantle things once they've been put into place. There's nothing more temporary than there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government measure, as they say. So I think it's going to take a lot of pushback from the public. And insofar as you see a situation where things are rapidly normalized in every segment of society, whether or not the airport can remain somewhat different from the rest of that, well, I will say that in the United States, people are still taking off their shoes. So I'm a little more pessimistic than optimistic.
So Professor Alford, in 30 seconds, you think the border restrictions will remain in place longer than masking requirements then?
I do. And I think that it's going to be a very strange situation given the patchwork. It may be very different if you're going to Mexico than going to Europe, for instance.
And Just to close that off, which do you think will be the last to go based on justifiability, Professor Serafin?
I think the border measures are probably going to be the last to go based on justifiability as well.